Hi class, the next thing we're going to review is Chapter 7, Long-Term Memory, and this area is going to be focused on encoding and retrieval. We will get to consolidation in a different video. So in this section we're going to consider some of these questions. The best way to store information in long-term memory, techniques we can use to help us retrieve information, and then we'll get to consolidation at a later time. So encoding, as a reminder, is acquiring information and then transforming it into memory, or taking your memories from your working memory and storing them in long-term memory. And then retrieval is pulling that information back out. And there are some ways that we can help our encoding process. One of them is by rehearsal. And there are two different kinds of rehearsal here. Maintenance rehearsal is repeating the stimuli in our working memory, but it does not transfer to long-term memory. So like when you're working with remembering a phone number, you're maintaining that, but then you're not storing that. When you have elaborative rehearsal, you are adding to that rehearsal. So you're perhaps applying meaning to it or developing connections that are semantic in nature to help transfer that information to long-term memory. So often we do that when we're trying to remember a new person that we've met, and we say, oh, Maggie, she has curly hair and she likes to swim. And so you're connecting that to other things that you know and elaborating to remember someone's name. Another thing that affects encoding is the depth of processing. So there are two depths we will discuss. Shallow processing, you are paying little attention to the meaning and you're focusing on the physical features of the information, and therefore you are having less encoding into your long-term memory. If you're processing something at a deep level, you are ascribing meaning, or you're paying closer attention to the meaning, and it improves memory. Here's an example of the levels of processing theory. The shallow category asked the person, are these capital letters or not? The medium level was, does this rhyme with carrot? And then deep processing would be, is it a bird? So you'll see the three different prompts would lead to three different outcomes. If they were just saying capital letters, yes or no, you could make that designation very quickly. If you were saying, does it rhyme with carrot? You would have to read and maybe sound it out aloud, parrot, carrot, but then you would be able to make that again fairly quickly. But looking at that word and deciding whether it's a bird or not takes a longer time to process and retrieve, and so that's a deep level of processing. So after a delay, a surprise memory test is given for the words. And then, of course, as I just described, if you were having to fill in the blanks, you would have to access the meaning of the word, and you have a greater % correct there because you know that a deep level of processing occurred. So that's levels of processing. Again, the take-home message here is that you should avoid rote rehearsal. So just repeating something is not going to be enough to get that encoded into your long-term memory. The best way to learn is to tie new information and meaning to something that you are encountering. A few factors that aid encoding. Visual imagery, so actually picturing a parrot might help you to figure out that that was a bird. So you're thinking of the actual images. The self-reference effect we'll talk about, and that is when you are able to connect something you are seeing or experiencing to a personal experience in the past. The generation effect, so actually generating information leads to better memory than if you are recognizing. We're going to talk about organizing in a moment. Relating words to survival value, so if you needed to know a list of items that you were going to take on a deserted island with you, it would be easier to recall than a list of general items, for example. So one thing that Bransford and Johnson did was with imagery. And so they had two experimental groups. The first group saw a picture that helped explain the information. The second group saw the picture after reading the passage, and the control group did not see the picture. And group one outperformed the others. I'm going to read the passage to you while we look at the photograph, but just keep in mind that in the actual experiment, only group one had this particular format. So this is the picture, and let me just get to the correct page in the book. Okay, so look at the picture, and as I read this, imagine, and let me zoom in a little bit here. Okay. If the balloons popped, the sound wouldn't be able to carry, since everything would be too far away from the correct floor. A closed window would also prevent the sound from carrying, since most buildings tend to be well insulated. Since the whole operation depends on the steady flow of electricity, a break in the middle of the wire would also cause problems. Of course, the fellow could shout, but the human voice is not loud enough to carry that far. An additional problem is that the string could break on the instrument. Then there would be no accompaniment to the message. It is clear that the best situation would involve less distance. Then there would be fewer potential problems. With face-to-face contact, the least number of things could go wrong. So imagine hearing that and not having the photo in front of you. It would be very difficult to tell what that was about. But in having this illustration, we were able to apply visual imagery to organize the information. And so this really illustrates how organizing our thoughts helps us to remember and retrieve information. The last thing we'll talk about here is retrieval practice. And again, with memory, we talked about this a little bit. What do you think would result in a stronger memory trace? Simply rereading material that you have learned, or being tested on the material? I think you'll likely know the answer, but Roediger and Karpicki in 2006 had participants read a passage, perhaps similar to what we just heard, and one group reread the passage, and the other group had to take a recall test, where they had to write down as much information as they could to remember. They were tested after a delay, and the group that had taken the test, where they recalled the first time, performed better, and so that is called the testing effect. You can see that here. So after just 5 minutes, the testing group actually didn't do as well, most likely because they were maybe only able to recall a little bit over 70% of the units there, whereas the other group had an opportunity to read it twice, so in the immediate sense they retained that a bit better. But then after 2 days and 1 week, that's really where we see the testing phenomenon come out. So the being forced to recall the information had a stronger effect in encoding into long-term memory. And that's just describing that here on this slide. So retrieval is the process of transferring information back from your long-term memory into your working memory. And in fact, most of our failures of memory are failures to retrieve, not failures to encode. So I'll be back with more information on long-term memory with another video.